very much indeed. Well, I just confess to you that I'm an atheist, and a secularist, and a humanist. And as you know, those three ists are different ists, or isms. Atheism is a metaphysical position. It's about what the universe does or doesn't contain, what kind of place the universe is. Does it contain supernatural entities of some kind? Perhaps there's 17 deities, either within space and time or outside it, or not. Secularism, as you know, is about the place of religion in the public square, in education, in public policy making, in the debate that we have in our societies about how we should live and treat one another. And humanism, as you know, is an ethical outlook, and it's an ethical outlook predicated on the idea that there aren't any gods or goddesses in the universe, and therefore it is our deep, profound responsibility to think about how we're to live and how we're to relate to our fellow human beings. So there is a natural connection between atheism and secularism and humanism, but you can be an atheist without being either of those other two things. You might, for example, have the crazy idea that religion should have a place at the top table in society. It should be at the head of the queue in matters of politics. There should be 26 bishops in the parliament of the country and so on. You could take that view, consistently with being an atheist. You might be both an atheist and a secularist and not be a humanist, perhaps, although what the basis of your moral outlook might be, I don't know. Especially given that humanism has its roots in the moral philosophy of classical antiquity, Socrates and Aristotle, and has been the de facto ethical outlook of most educated people for more than 1,000 years longer than Christianity has been officially accepted from the late 4th century of the Common Era onwards. So I just mentioned those things so you can discount the remarks I'm about to make, since they come from a partisan point of view. And my partisan point of view about RE is that the very name religious education is open to misinterpretation. Now, when I was a boy, which you may think was a little while ago now, some of you here might remember this too, what happened in schools was called RI, religious instruction. Instruction in the tenets and duties of the faith that happened to be associated with the school where you were being educated. The change of title to religious education is meant to indicate education about religious outlooks, although of course the opportunity is taken in too many places, in too many schools, for it to be education in a religious outlook rather than education about religious outlooks, plural. And that means that what happens in different schools, especially if they're faith-based schools, can be rather equivocal. Now, I take the view that no education can be complete unless it includes an account of the major religious traditions of history and the world. They should definitely be taught about. But if they are the only thing which is taught about, if you take religion out of the much larger context to which it belongs, you give it a false importance. You give it a completely misleading emphasis. What I would like to see is a central part of the curriculum devoted to the history of ideas, the history of how people have thought about the world, how they have attempted to understand it, how they've attempted to explain it, how they've attempted to provide themselves with a sense of place in the universe and what significance it has for them. One can go right back to the very earliest outlooks captured in the mythologies of the world, and then look at the early endeavours at philosophy and science, dating well before the rise of classical civilization. One could put into that context the different religious beliefs, the different creation mythologies, and one would notice that there is a grand narrative about our human efforts to make sense of our world and our place in it. It starts off with all sorts of stories premised on the thought that nature must be the outcome of agency of some kind. I mean, think about it. One can do a kind of Nietzschean genealogy of how these ideas arose. One could imagine when our very earliest ancestors had the opportunity, the leisure to reflect a little bit on the world around them, and they asked themselves the question, how the hell does all this happen? Where does it come from? And what makes it work? The one thing that they had available to them as an explanatory handle was their own felt capacity as agents. You all know the classicists among you, ego, agere, acti, actum, you know, to act, to be an agent, to do something. Pick up a stone, throw it into a pond, makes a splash. You did it. You're the causal source of this event in the world. Therefore, the wind, the thunder, the growth of the plants, they must be the outcome of agency. And indeed, we can see this when we look at mythologies. We can see how they personified these agencies. There they were, the nymphs and the dryads in the streams and the trees. There was a god under the sea who caused earthquakes. There was a god in the sky who caused thunder and lightning. Almost every aspect of our psychology and of our behavior in society was influenced in one or another way by the gods and goddesses. Aphrodite, Ares, Hermes. You can see this rich mythological apparatus provided a framework, a setting for our understanding of the world and its operations. And that would be something that most religions have their roots in. It started off as a kind of proto-science. And indeed, they may even have quickly become a kind of proto-technology. Because if you thought that you had some understanding of the agencies at work in the universe, you quite soon might think you could influence them in some way, with prayer or sacrifice, propitiation. If you could communicate with these agencies and get them to bring the rain in the drought, or to stop the rain when it floods, or to help you defeat your enemies, then you would naturally do that. Because my own feeling is that the sense that the agencies constituting the mechanism of the world could be contacted probably came from nightmares, dreams, from fevers, from consuming something that had become alcoholic without you realizing it. It fermented while it was in your bag, and then you consumed it, and then of course you met the gods, and that was jolly interesting, and you felt a bit hungover afterwards. So there must have been some point at which some bloke, and I'm pretty sure it was a bloke, who thought to himself, if I can persuade all the other members of my tribe that I can speak to these agencies and influence them, then I'm going to get all the money and all the girls. And that was the moment when religion, as opposed to just proto-science and proto-technology, probably became a significant feature of social organization. And of course, temporal powers have always found religions useful, or almost always. Sometimes they've persecuted various religions for various reasons. The Romans, for example, until Constantine, with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, decriminalized Christianity. By the way, it was because his mum was a Christian, you know what mums are like. And he decriminalized Christianity at that point. Up until then, Christians had been thought to be atheists because they wouldn't take part in the great public celebrations that brought the very, very diverse, enormous Roman Empire together. Never forget that the word religion comes from the Latin religio, religere, which means to bind or to bring together. We get our word ligature from the same root, to tie up. Now, if you have a huge number of different ethnicities and languages and cultures and traditions and belief systems, you want a religion, something that will bring people together. So the great public observances of Roman religion, worshipping the emperor or Jupiter, big feast days, big processions, big parties, the opportunity to have a bit of a bean feast. And of course, the Christians weren't going to have anything to do with that. They had already demonized the gods of the mythological traditions. Pagans, the word comes from a root which means a peasant or a country person, sticking to their little local beliefs and superstitions and traditions, were regarded as hostile to or dangerous to the story about the one true God. So you can see how the temporal powers first persecuted some religions, but then made them, authorized them. One of the hidden chapters in the history of religion in the Common Era is that within half a century of Constantine making Christianity legitimate, which happened, as I say, in 313, in 380, the Emperor Theodosius I, in the Edict of Thessalonica, made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and the only permitted religion of the Roman Empire. And for 200 years afterwards, the Christians, newly empowered, given their place at the head of the queue, were pulling down temples and burning books and destroying classical civilization. They were the ISIS of their day, except they did it for 200 years. They got rid of over 90% of classical literature. They used the stones of the so-called pagan temples to build their churches. There's a very interesting book by Catherine Nixie, published just last year, called The Darkening Age, the period of time when the Dark Ages began. And this is a chapter of history that, of course, it's not part of RE to study, is it, to explain how religion was imposed. And by the way, a little interesting footnote here too. You may have occasion to mention St. Augustine, one of the great fathers of the Church. Well, why was he so significant in the early history of Christianity? It's because when Constantine decriminalized Christianity, he made it fashionable. Well, the bourgeois and the patricians and the rich people of the Roman Empire wanted to follow suit. It was, it was the cool thing to be. And when they read some of the scriptures and heard some of the teachings, they found a couple of inconveniences. Easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That's a bit of a facer if you're a rich Roman. What about the fact that you're meant to turn the other cheek, love your enemies, blessed are the peacemakers, and so on, when you are a senior member of a mighty military empire? That's a bit of an annoyance as well. But who should come right to the rescue but St. Augustine? Oh, you don't want to worry about all that, he said. All you have to do is, if you donate some money to the poor, the souls of the poor will waft your soul into heaven when you die. And also he said, all that business about turning the other cheek and blessed are the peacemakers, he said, do you remember the centurion who came to Jesus and said, my son is sick, will you cure him? Jesus said, okay, I'll come with you. The centurion said, oh no need. I'm an officer in the army. I give orders and they're obeyed. All you have to do is give an order and he'll be cured. And Jesus said, oh, your faith has made your son whole. And St. Augustine said, see, he didn't tell the officer in the army to resign his commission and become a pacifist, did he? So it's okay to be a mighty military empire. Etc., etc., or as the King of Siam said, etc., etc., okay? So you can see that there might be a way of doing religious education which would make religion look very different in history. But I am navigating. I should get back to my main theme, which is this, that if you had a history of ideas, a history of the way that we humans have tried to make sense of our world, if we went back to the creation myths, the many, many creation myths there are, the many religious traditions that stem from them, based on this idea that our only way of explaining things was to do so in terms of agency. There must be causally efficacious agents choosing to do things like make thunder and lightning. If we then saw, with the rise of classical civilization, efforts to try to think about the world. I mean, you all know that in philosophy, for example, we regard Thales of Miletus, who lived in the 6th century, as the so-called father of philosophy. Why? Because he was interested in a question, the question, what is the universe made of? Where does it come from? What is the arche, which means the principle, the basis of the universe? And the answer he came up with was water. The universe is made of water. Now why did he think that? Well, because first, water is everywhere. It's in the sea, the soil is damp, it falls out of the sky, it's in your veins. You cut a tree, it oozes out of the tree. It is ubiquitous. Also, it is essential to life. Without water, things die. Thirdly, water produces soil. Proof? The Nile. Every year it floods, masses of silt come out of the Nile, so obviously water is producing soil. Fourthly, it is the only thing we know capable of taking all physical manifestations. Liquid in its natural state, steam and air when it boils away as steam, and ice, a solid, when it freezes. Therefore, its ubiquity, its necessity, its metamorphic properties, its essential role that it plays in life and in the world means that water must be the basis of everything. Well, we're not all that inclined to agree with him now that that's the case. After all, we remember the story of the man who had whiskey and water on Monday night and had a terrible hangover the next day. Tuesday, therefore, he tried gin and water instead, still had a terrible hangover. Wednesday was brandy and water, he thought to himself, what's common to all that? So we would think that we would give up drinking water on that basis. So we might want to agree with Thales. But it's not the answer he gave, but the way he sought to give the answer. He used his powers of observation, and he used his powers of reason, and he tried to work it out on that ground. He didn't go to ancient traditions or ancient writings or superstitions to give an explanation. What a contrast there is between Hesiod, who was writing just maybe a century and a half before Thales, and the Works and Days, and the Theogony. His explanation of the origin of the universe and its nature is a paradigm of a mythological or religious view. But Thales used observation and reason. And that was a moment that set going the great tradition of philosophical and eventually scientific thought in the Western tradition. And there were very, very fine thinkers who employed exactly the same observational and rational approach to things in the very rich traditions of philosophy in India and in China. And so these are important moments in the history of humanity. There's no surprise as to why that era, so-called axial age, around about the 6th, 5th century before the Common Era, marked a big turning point in the history of human civilization. And an even bigger one, of course, 16th century Reformation. What's important about that? Not just that Martin Luther wasn't charged with vandalism for nailing his theses to the church door of Wittenberg, but the fact that when Europe split into Protestant and Catholic communities, in the Protestant part of Europe, the churches weren't powerful enough to stop people thinking and speaking and writing. They were still powerful enough in the Catholic parts of Europe. They could shut people up, they could burn them at the stake, like Giordano Bruno and various others. But in the Protestant parts, they couldn't. The immediate result of the Reformation was a great ebullition of interest, an explosion of interest in alchemy and astrology and Kabbalah and Metacism and astrology. But very soon, people began to realize that in all this chaos, this mess of people trying to live forever, change lead into gold and so on, that if they were to get the right method and to separate out the nonsense from the sense, the alchemy from the chemistry, the astrology from the astronomy, the medicine from the magic, if they could do that, we could really begin to learn about our world and to achieve some degree of mastery over it. The very first books that Descartes, René Descartes, we all know about him, I drink, therefore I am, it's on every pub board in the country. The very first book he published was A Discourse on Method. Francis Bacon, all his work was about how we should conduct inquiry, how we should put the question to nature, how we should experiment. These early thinkers, the early modern period thinkers about method, that's why they are quoted. Bacon is quoted by the founders of the Royal Society, the great scientific institution, because of his focus on the question of methodology. And so it was getting rid of the hegemony over thought of a religious outlook, dogma and doctrine. Don't forget this. When in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, around about 500 AD, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, a great deal of effort was made by the so-called fathers, the patristic writers of the church, to persuade people that the doctrines, the tenets, and the narratives of Christianity were plausible. That kind of literature is known as apologetics. By the high medieval period, there was no more apologetical writing, because by that time it was a criminal offense not to believe those doctrines and narratives, and you could be killed, executed for not accepting them, and many people were. And indeed, when people started to question in the Renaissance, the persecution of heresy and of disagreement and of atheism became extreme in the form of the Inquisition. By the 18th century, after the rise of science in the 16th, 17th centuries, in the 18th century, apologetics came back. When you think of Dr. William Paley and the watchmaker and so on, that's apologetics. That's an attempt to, because you could no longer kill people for not believing it, you have to try and persuade them again. So after all that long period of time, apologetics came back into the picture. And in a way, you know, RI, as was an attempt to keep religion alive. Everybody knows, every faith group knows that you've got to get kids to accept that it makes sense to think in terms of these stories and these doctrines. Because even if they give up for a certain point, they're going to come back to it. We all know the trajectory, okay? When you're a kid, you, for very good evolutionary reasons, you believe everything the adults in your community tell you. You believe in Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, God, and so on. I hope this is not bad news for anybody here, but there's no Father Christmas. There's no Tooth Fairy, although my youngest daughter, who I was trying to bring up as an atheist, she said to me, I don't believe in gods, Daddy, because I always used to say to her, don't say God as if it's a name, say gods and goddesses when you're talking to people, or Fred. Use the name Fred. So who created the world? Fred. Well, then you can see that it's just nonsense because it doesn't mean anything at all. She said, well, I don't believe in Fred or gods and goddesses, but I do believe in the Tooth Fairy. And I said, well, you've got good empirical evidence for that. So you're quite right to do it. It happens that I was the local Tooth Fairy, but at least, as I said. But then when Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy vanish, the God thing remains. Churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, they're all over the place. Great moments of social significance, like royal marriages, coronations, and Christmas and Easter. There are men, it's always men, isn't it, with the head of religions. I'll come back to that point in a minute. There's all men, they're all in their dresses, officiating. And this is a powerful social reinforcement of religion in society. So here's the trajectory. Little kids believe everything. They get to be teenagers, they believe nothing, of course. That's a big change in their outlook. Believe nothing that a grown-up saying. And then in any case, that's the sort of courting years. It's very hard to be religious when you're horny, because religion is a nuisance. It gets in the way of trying to express yourself a little bit at that important time. Later on in life, your parents die, you lose your job, you go bankrupt, you're middle-aged, you look at yourself in the mirror and don't recognize yourself. You feel, oh, what's happened? You think, oh, I was happier when I was a child. I've lost my belief, that's what it is. So you hasten to your local religious community, the local church, and what happens? You're met by very nice people who welcome you. You're part of a new group. It's lovely, and it's very affirming. And most people transfer the sense of having a nice group of new friends to the religion. It's the religion which is making them feel better. So then they feel better for a while, but empirical data shows that people who return to religious observance later on in life, it doesn't tend to stick. After a while, they're sitting there listening to the virgin birth and this, that, and the other, and they're thinking, well, do you know what? It doesn't really hang together, this. So they tend to sort of slip away into what I call the feng shui tendency, crystals, reading their horoscope again and what have you, and then after that they give up altogether. There's a wonderful triptych that shows the young male, age 19, who know it all, and then the middle-aged man, age 40, say it all, pontificating away, and then the old boy in his retirement home saying, oh, bugger it all. Anyway, so it's a natural trajectory, and religion has its moments during the course of it. But institutionally, religion seems to governments, to politicians, to people who, to moralists. Now, a moralist is a person who says, I don't like it, therefore you are not allowed to do it. I don't like it, so you're not allowed to see it. Remember Mrs. Whitehouse? Only woman in the world with a television set that didn't have an off button. So she was forced to look at all those naked people after 9 o'clock at night and write these letters to the BBC about it. I don't like it, so nobody else is allowed to look at it. That's the moralist for you. And in order to try to nip in the bud, any, wanting to watch television after 9 o'clock at night, you've got to make sure that you infiltrate this idea into children's minds in the hope that you will get them back later. They'll believe it now, they'll lose their belief maybe, but even if they do, you might be able to get them back later. So that's a really important role. The temporal powers, the governments and educational institutions and so on, link up with faith organizations in order, they say, to provide a moral basis or a moral outlook in life, something that you can hang on to. Why is it that it has been such a struggle to get humanism into the curriculum, when humanism is so rational, kindly, highly pro-social outlook, and one where the responsibility of the individual to make and nurture good relationships with others, to recognize that the fundamental thing, the key thing about our moral lives is the humanity of our fellows in the human story and our responsibility for nature. To be kind to animals and to think about future generations and what they're going to inherit from us depending upon how we behave now. That is the humanistic outlook. Why isn't that taught in schools? If humanism were adopted by everybody everywhere, one very, very major reason for conflict would die away. I mean, look at the terrible tragedy unfolding before our eyes today in the Islamic world. The vast majority of deaths, vast majority of suffering is Muslim on Muslim suffering. Because Sunni and Shiite, because all of the 62 different sects of Islam are so at odds with one another. And the result is this terrible proxy war that we're witness to now. You know, the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia against the Shiites in Iran, and they're using what's happening in the Middle East as a way of having a war with one another. And this is just another chapter in a dismal series of chapters. The 30 Years' War of the 17th century, very, very significantly an outcome of the attempt by Catholicism to get the Protestant lands of Europe back. Of course, they wanted the property and the revenues back and so on, so it wasn't just religion. But they also thought that the Protestants were all damned. I mean, you know that the great principle of the Inquisition was, since you're a heretic, I'm going to kill you now to save you from any further sin, because you'd have to spend longer in purgatory, so I'm doing you a big favour by setting fire to your feet. Well, that was the same motivation behind the attempt by the Holy Roman Empire to get the Protestant lands back in the 17th century. In the 16th century, the wars of religion in France were so vicious, they were so bitter. When you think about religious conflict, it is awful because you're fighting with absolute right on your side. You have the truth. Everybody else is wrong. They're either demonic or their souls have to be saved by being killed. And that's why religious war is so bitter. Again, I divagate. So, we're talking about the history of ideas, of which religions are one strand. And if you were to look at the history of ideas, as it were, from the moon, you will notice mythologies, but then you start to get people like Thales and Socrates and Aristotle and the Stoics and so on. All of them beginning to think more rationally. And then you see out of philosophy the rise of science. You see the mythologies getting more organized, coming to be useful to temporal powers, turning into official religions, and being given a lot of support by them. But you see religion as being actually part of the earlier phase of human thinking, and rational thought and scientific thought as the more mature phase of human thinking. Isn't it absolutely extraordinary and a distortion of our education system that we don't put it like that to them, that in fact we leave out the whole story about philosophy and the rise of science, and we concentrate just on one aspect of it, which is religion. And when we teach about religion, what do we teach? We teach the major doctrines and traditions. We teach something about what people do and believe. We don't teach about the grounds that they have for asserting the truth of what they say. We don't teach them about the theological and philosophy of religion challenges that there are to the claims that religion make. Why don't we do those things? Why don't we try to encourage a really thoroughgoing critical appreciation of them, subject them to exactly the same kind of scrutiny that we subject hypotheses and suggested theories in the sciences? I mean, after all, one of the great things that we expect to come out of an education is not just a view about how things are in our world and what people have thought about them in the past, but also how to evaluate them, how to assess them critically. That's very important. So I think that education about religious traditions should be one, but only one component of this much greater, richer, deeper, more important story about how we humans have thought about the world and tried to make sense of it overall. And we would then see it in its true proportion, and we would see that in competition with ways of exploring the world and thinking about the world, doesn't have that much to recommend, which is what I was just about to say, but I was trying to think of a slightly more ironic note on which to end. But perhaps there are moments in the great discussion about the place of religion in education where one needn't be that ironic. So that's my view. History of ideas, religion is just as a component of it, and the different religious traditions, but even there, all the aspects of the history of ideas should be approached critically, and we should understand why it is that later methodologies, later ways of thinking, later ways of viewing the universe have advantages over earlier ways. And if we were to do that, I think we would provide educated minds to our society. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments, or complaints? There is a microphone, by the way, which will do the rounds. Perhaps we start right where you are.
I think I'm going up. I think I might take advantage of having the microphone in my hands. Professor Grayling, would you like to say a few words about how this history of ideas approach to religion and belief education, how that would interact with other approaches such as more sociological, more current affairs, more citizenship-based approaches to learning about role of religion and belief in today's world?
Well, the problem that we're always faced with is how crowded the curriculum is already, and to try to understand sociological, social, psychological, and civics aspects. And by the way, I do think that civics education, in my slightly different but related strand, I think that we should have a very strong theme of civics education about voting, about the political order, about the constitution. We should make it compulsory. We should lower the voting age to 16 and make voting compulsory in our society. We should really try our hardest to get people more involved. I think we should have a kind of political bar mitzvah about the age of 16 for everybody, so that when our young people get to that age, they can feel that since they can join the army now and marry and do various other things, they can also step up to a responsible, thoughtful role in being involved in our society. But I'm off piste again, sorry. So the answer is there room in the curriculum to introduce some sociological perspectives? Can we try to make sense of our society in addition to the history of ideas in our history and literature lessons? After all, they are the ones also that give us a sense of perspective and dimensionality in our thinking about the world. It really is a matter more of the content of the curriculum in those respects. There's a gentleman right next to you there.
In the idea of the history of ideas, absolutely, yes, 100% about that entirely. But perhaps part of the history of ideas is the history of the development of religious education. And that is where deliberately, I've talked about this already, but deliberately there was an attempt to abandon and leave well behind religious instruction and make sure that where there was religion being explored in the classroom, it was absolutely 100% educational, and that was to be exploratory, as objective as possible, and critical. So early developments in that were things like the Birmingham Agreed Civics in 75, where there's, in a document of only 400 pages, there are 4 references into being critical exploration. And I just think there's part of that history of ideas where it would be worthwhile looking more closely at what's actually happened in RE, which is completely different from what it was back in the 50s or the early 60s.
Indeed. In fact, there's a very important aspect of what you say there, because this whole idea now seems such a cliche, doesn't it, about being critical, knowing how to evaluate claims, information, theories, and to develop those skills at having a good nose for a sound argument, or how to deconstruct a bad argument. And these things are tremendously important. All the more important now, because, of course, at the touch of a button and the speed of light, you can get information about almost everything. So the old-fashioned way of the teacher downloading from his or her necktop to the necktops of the pupils in the classroom some facts and dates and equations, almost superseded by the fact that all this stuff is out there in cyberspace already. But what's out there in cyberspace is not only all the information, but because it is the biggest lavatory wall in history with all the graffiti and rubbish and pornography and lies and misinformation on it, we also have to equip our students to know how to deal with all that and to be really, really good at picking the wheat from the chaff out there. So this idea of being critical and reflective is really important. On the matter of the history of education, well, when you think about the very Banosic, as a nice word, attitude that we have to education these days, it's about getting a job. It's about, training people so they can become foot soldiers in the great economic war, And you contrast that to what Aristotle said about education. Aristotle said we educate ourselves so that we can make a noble use of our leisure. That's a 180-degree different from how we think about what education is for now. And what we should do, we educationalists, we know that what we're trying to do is to educate a mind, to help a spirit grow, to make people independent and to think for themselves and not to be duped by Cambridge Analytica on social media and so on. And that is our aim. But of course, the pressures on us and the fact that we educate at completely the wrong time, both of day and of life, is a great barrier that we have to overcome. Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, his My Early Life, he had an incredibly unhappy time. Where was he? At Harrow or somewhere. He had a very unhappy time at school. And he said, I think kids should be taught for 3 hours, and then at about the age of 10, they should be let go, do what they like, or go into the fields, or do agriculture, or play sport. And then when they are hungry to know, they will rush back into education, and in a tenth of the time, they will learn the things that we try and stuff into them by keeping them at school through their adolescent years. Well, he may have a point there. Although, of course, there are plenty of people who would rather put a Kalashnikov into the hands of a teenager than let them out of school at that age, I suppose. But we could have a revolutionary approach to these things, and that would be one solution to RE. We wouldn't be teaching anything, so we wouldn't be teaching it.
Thank you. Hello. That was wonderful. Thank you. I had a brilliant experience once learning about this, a way of reading Jewish texts through I'm not Jewish, through a Jewish lens called Pardes, which is a way of increasingly going into the meaning of the texts. And it was really thrilling to see what I could unlock in that text, but also to look at Jewish writing through a Jewish lens. I wonder if your wonderful history of ideas, I'm an RE teacher, it speaks to me so much. I would love to make that operational in my classroom. And I'm a Westerner, and you're a Westerner, and I like this way of thinking, of taking things to pieces and looking at how it works. I wonder if this is a Western way of looking at Western history, the Western history of ideas. This is my actual question, sorry about the preamble. Is it possible to look at other cultures in the world, other ancient traditions, other rich and fascinating parts of the world, their beliefs, their histories, through a lens which is not imposing on them, suits how they think and how they've operated through history?
It's one of the great dilemmas, isn't it, of intercultural studies or anthropology indeed, or looking at different traditions of thought. It happens, apropos, I'm just at the moment writing a history of philosophy, and notice it's a history of philosophy, not a history of Western philosophy. Although it's mainly a history of Western philosophy, but I'm putting in some sort of surveys, some excursuses into the Indian, Chinese, and Persian Arab traditions. People mistakenly call the Islamic tradition of philosophy Persian Arab. And I have no expertise in Sanskrit, and I don't know ancient Chinese. I speak contemporary Chinese, but I can't read ancient Chinese or understand it. And I don't have Arabic. So I'm doing this very, very much at second hand. But just so long as you're conscious of the fact you're doing that, and you alert your readers, your listeners, to the fact that you're doing that, you're coming at it from your perspective, your Western perspective, it actually gives you a bit of an opportunity, which is to see how the connections work between your own tradition of thought and those that you're looking at. You can see resonances. I mean, think for example of one of the major philosophical traditions in India is Advaita. Now, dva, dva in Sanskrit means two. A, like in Latin and Greek, is a privative particle, so it means not two. So Advaita means non-dualist view in metaphysics. Well, we're all conscious of the dualistic view about the nature of reality and the monist view, which is that there is only matter and so on. So there is an immediate connection, even through the most fundamental way of trying to conceive of the constituents of reality. So it is possible to view another tradition of thought that way, but to get right down to the depths of it, you have to have the language, you've got to immerse yourself into it. I can take one more. I'm afraid I'm having an open day at my college at the moment. I've got a whole lot of visitors there, and I've just dashed over from that little bit of lunchtime exercise. So I'll take one more, and then I'm afraid I'll have to dash off. I'm terribly sorry. That gentleman's been very patient.
I fear you may well be speaking as an Oxford professor rather than as a school teacher. I'm not a school teacher, but I do remember that in every other subject you learn the basis of facts. Indeed, even when I was an undergraduate as classics, it was basically trying to get at the facts. It's only if you went further than I do to doctoral research that you were supposed to think for yourself. And aren't you just being too ambitious in asking people to understand the history of ideas? Religious is one of the less complicated ones, and it's just beyond and what you can be expected of a teenager.
Oh, I don't think so. I think that's not all that fair to teenagers. Look, it doesn't take very much to say something like this. To explain, for example, the outcome of biblical scholarship in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as a result of splendid work that was done, especially in the German scholarly tradition in the 19th century, we now know how the Bible and religion, the Old and New Testaments, were put together, how they were written, how the documents of the New Testament were chosen some 400 years after the events that they relate to. And once we say that, we can say, well, what parallel scholarship is there about the Quran, let us say? The view that Muslims take about the Quran as a very sacred text, so sacred indeed that to maltreat a copy of the Quran is regarded as sacrilege, means that it's incredibly difficult to do that kind of scholarship and see how did that text emerge and are there different versions of it and what kinds of interpretations can we place on it. I mean, for example, there is a surah in the Quran which tells of how Aisha, who you remember married Muhammad, Muhammad was a bit mean, he had 13 wives, he only allowed his followers to have 4. I should just mention, by the way, sort of in passing, that in every single religion known to humanity, bar one, the founders of that religion have always been men, and they have always entitled themselves to a large number of wives. Mr. Smith, who founded Mormonism back in the 1820s and 30s, allowed himself over 30 wives. Much more modestly, Mr. David Icke, you remember that sports reporter who started his own religion here, a religion of lizards for outer space, I think it is. He's been quite modest, he's only allowed himself 4. He's a man who was questioned because he didn't like to fly in airplanes. He was asked why he was afraid of flying. He said, I'm not afraid of flying, I'm afraid of crashing, which shows that he had some degree of it. The only religion which doesn't allow a plurality of wives is Christianity. And the reason for it is that the founder of Christianity, the man who made it up, really, St. Paul, was gay. Do you want the proof for that? Anyway, why have I got off piece? Oh yes, so just to go back to the point. How difficult is it to explain something about biblical criticism and scholarship and therefore to say how much credence can be placed in the scriptural traditions and the teachings? Look at the great controversy. Explain, for example, the great schism in Christianity between Western and Eastern Christianity, Orthodox and Roman Christianity, turns on the word and. In fact, an even smaller word than the word and, it turns on the word et, the Latin for and. Is it from the Father and the Son that the Holy Ghost proceeds, or from Whole wars were fought over the question of hand, and an enormous split in culture and religion, and therefore of history. You know, these are things, but I've just explained it in 2 or 3 sentences. Of course a 14 or 13-year-old can understand that, and it can put it to work. They can ask themselves a question. They can say to themselves, hang on, does this all add up? I remember this. I can tell you this story and then I'm going to rush away. I had the great good fortune to be brought up in a completely non-religious household. We weren't even CBE, Christmas and Easter. We didn't go to church at all. And when I went to my big boarding school, we had chapel every day, 10 minutes. We took no notice of it, whatever. We just finished our prep and flicked ink pellets about another and so on, until we had a new chaplain came to the school. And this new chaplain pronounced, there was a collect, it was an Anglican school, so it was a collect, something like, "O Lord, open thou our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit, that we may truly love thee and worthily magnify thy holy name." It reminds me of Augustus Hare, who used to have morning prayers at his country house every day, and people noticed that the prayers sounded really odd, and they looked at his book, his copy of the 1662 prayer book, and it had lots of inkings out in it, and they said, why have you done that? And he said, well, I mean, these prayers are full of praises of the deity. Now, the deity is a gentleman. No gentleman likes to be praised to his face. So all this business about we may worthily magnify their holy name, he inked them all out. Didn't like them at all. Anyway, that was sort of a character thing. This new chaplain said, "Whoa, Lord," like that, you know, like a revivalist, you know. So everybody sat up in the chapel. What's this? He said, "Open thou our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit." I thought, that's interesting. I'd just been reading about the Muses and how the Muses breathed in, inspired the poets and Homer and all that. So I went up to the chaplain and I said, right, this Christianity business, give me something to read. I was a very earnest and swotty schoolboy. He gave me a great reading list. Bishop Robinson's Honest to God, Dostoevsky, The Notes from Underground, I mean all sorts of things. Said you must read the Epistle to the Romans, it's the great converting epistle of Christianity. That school holiday, I read it all. Got back to school, I went to see him. I said, I've read everything you've asked me to read, and I have a question for you. And the question is, how can you believe this stuff? I was really absolutely amazed. And he said, well, every morning when I wake, I pray, "Oh Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief." I said, well, you don't believe it either, do you? This is in violation of the Trades Descriptions Act here. This is really no. And this idea that a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old couldn't, if given the opportunity to think things through and be allowed to challenge and to disagree and to say, that doesn't add up, I think it's an opportunity that we should take. Anyway, my apologies.
So we are a little over time. So maybe we'll take just a quick, we'll take a break till past if anyone just needs to get some water or anything, and then we'll just go straight on to the second issues roundtable. Thank you.